So thank you very much. Thank you, Josh. It's a great honour and a great pleasure. Thank you for people for coming from far and wide, especially my family, some of whom have travelled all the way from West Wales today. Lots of other people, though. It's really nice to see everybody. I'm conscious that it's 5:30 on a Friday evening as well, especially to colleagues who've come along. And obviously it's a serious subject and it's a serious talk, but I've transgressed a little bit towards the beginning mostly, as you will see. On the little piece of paper you've come around with the title, it says Utopian Justice, but my mistake entirely, Christiana, she's still here, oh yes, that I didn't add the question mark. But the question mark is actually very important, as I'll come to later on. And to begin then, and just to set the scene, I just want to go back a couple of years to August 2011. And in the aftermath of several days of civil unrest across towns and cities in England, the Prime Minister addresses the nation.
Do we have the determination to confront the slow-motion moral collapse that has taken place in parts of our country these past few generations? Irresponsibility, selfishness, behaving as if your choices have no consequences. Children without fathers, schools without discipline, reward without effort, crime without punishment, rights without responsibilities, communities without control. Some of the worst aspects of human nature tolerated, indulged, sometimes even incentivized by a state and its agencies that in parts have become literally demoralized.
Fortunately, the government has a plan with measures to support families, a determined assault on social exclusion, policies to help children achieve at school, providing real opportunities for jobs, training and leisure, action to tackle drug misuse with new initiatives in the criminal justice system, ways of reinforcing parents' responsibilities, and action to extend the range of community penalties for young offenders. Now, as some of you probably already guessed, there is a problem with the plan, and that's that it's 16 years old. It's actually the plan laid out by the new Labour government in a white paper, No More Excuses. Can I take you back to those days? The new Labour government was true to its word. The Crime and Disorder Act gave the youth justice system a new statutory aim, the prevention of offending. New structures, a youth justice board overseeing multi-agency youth offending teams. New objectives, including confronting young offenders with the consequences of their offending, and helping young offenders to develop a sense of personal responsibility. New modes of punishment, including final warnings, parenting orders, detention and training orders, and new ways of working. For example, structured risk assessment, evidence-based practice, cognitive behavioural therapy, and mentoring. Which rather begs the question, where did it all go wrong? So, my career as a researcher of youth crime and youth justice began amidst this minor revolution in the official system for dealing with young offenders. Indeed, I consider myself complicit in that enterprise, and early on even a carrier of the faith. This has since dwindled, and in part this lecture will reflect on that transition in my thinking. But more generally, the reason for undertaking the PhD by Public Works was to try and make collective sense of the various one-off studies pertaining to youth crime and youth justice in which I'd been involved over a period of approximately 10 years. at the outset, this seemed an insuperable challenge. How, for example, could I account for and justify the methodological jungle represented in my work? A messy mixture of quantity and quality, of questionnaires, focus groups, variously constructed interviews, primary and secondary sources, of observed real life and foot-deep case files. How to review the literature when, due to the timescale involved, a good deal of it was read or indeed written after the studies took place. How to pinpoint the singular contribution I have made to knowledge when the goals of the research presented here have typically reflected the concerns of policymakers, funding bodies and senior colleagues more than they did my own. Most of all, perhaps, how to find any coherence in studies of and writings on school students' experience of violence, the relationship between school exclusion and offending, drugs education, young people as victims of street crime, the role of risk assessment, mentoring. If someone suggested this to a potential PhD supervisor, the supervisor would sigh and gently suggest that the student select one of these broad topic areas and then see how you could narrow the focus a little further. Nevertheless, it appears that I pulled it off. And today, that's the story I'm going to tell of how I brought together the PhD by Public Works. So the rest of the lecture will contextualise the public works, put them in the place of other literature, will reflect on some of the problems facing the applied social researcher, ones that I considered in the course of doing the PhD. It will unload my canon, as it were, it will consider my public works. It will explain what I mean by utopian justice and why that question mark is important. So, there is a considerable wealth of books, journal articles, published policy and research on the subjects of youth crime and youth justice, of course. And so situating my own contributions within this enormous bank of knowledge has not been straightforward. Needles and haystacks come to mind. Still, a few highlights. First then, the discovery of children and young people as victims of crime. A body of evidence has emerged in the past few decades which shows that, in Heartless et al.'s phrase, children and young people are more sinned against than sinning. The inclusion in the 1994 British Crime Survey of under 16-year-olds produced dramatic results. According to our man who wrote the study up, children were 5 times more likely than adults to have been stolen from and 7 times more likely to have been assaulted. Further surveys since have only confirmed, as Brown says, that despite young people's undoubted involvement in offending, this is far outweighed by their vulnerability as victims. Though the site of most reported victimisation, what the research suggests is that schools are viewed as relatively safe places by young people. It also tells us that this view is rational and evidence-based. It is in public spaces where the more serious youth violence occurs. Risk factor research in the 1990s identified that young people excluded from school were more likely to offend. And the Social Exclusion Unit picked that up. Tackling exclusion and truancy should contribute to stopping youngsters being drawn into crime in the first place, they said. Meanwhile, research into school exclusion itself found that you were more likely to be excluded if you were male, black, disabled, or poor. And that exclusion was typically preceded by some dimension of familial stress. In short, school exclusion was an indicator of broader patterns of social exclusion. As for the relationship between social exclusion and youth crime, research produced compelling evidence that this had blossomed, if that's the word, in the 1980s and 90s. in an analysis of 13,140 murders committed in Britain in the period, 1980 to 2000, Dorling reveals that the chances of being murdered dramatically changed. Most of the population were less likely to have been murdered as time went on. But for young men, the chances rose by 100% in the case of 20 to 24-year-olds. As for where people were being murdered, Dorling observes that this too was changing over time. In 1981 to 1985, those living in the poorest tenth of neighbourhoods were already 4.5 times more likely to be murdered. By 1996 to 2000, they were 5.5 times more likely to be murdered. As for how, this seemed to change little. The most common causes of death were cutting by knives and other sharp objects, and whilst the number of individuals killed by guns had risen slightly in all areas, guns actually accounted for a higher proportion of murders in wealthier wards. Finally, and most tendentiously perhaps, Dorling considers why poor young men were increasingly likely to be murdered during the period in question. His answer is damning. In the high-crime neighbourhoods where sometimes deadly street violence is most concentrated, offending and victimisation blur. As Yates observes, to quote, "While the young people caught up in the criminal justice system as perpetrators are disproportionately drawn from working-class backgrounds with biographies replete with examples of their vulnerability, it is also apparent that victims of crime are drawn from the same group. Those growing up in deprived areas also have a much greater chance of being a victim of crime. Most children raised in poverty do not become involved in crime, but there are higher victim and fear of crime rates in disadvantaged areas." Okay. There it is again. New Labour, of course, arrived in office armed with a discourse about social exclusion and famously promised to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Tough talk aside, however, its youth strategy was deeply managerialist, created almost literally by the Audit Commission, from whose damning assessment of the old youth justice, written in 1996, emerged a very simple formula. Thank you, Brian Cox. The formula then was that what we needed was consistent assessment of the risk factors associated with youth offending. Okay, that would identify the most at risk. And then practice that was based on evidence of what works. Very logical, very managerial. Okay. I'm going to spare you for now the review of the literature that I did on this turn in youth justice, as we'll return to it in the course of the lecture. What I cannot resist sharing is just one tiny cameo observation made by John Pitts to the effect that were a Martian to have landed up in a yacht at this time, they could easily believe the following.
Report to base. Today I visited a youth offending team. The people there work with young offenders. Young offenders are about 1 foot tall. They live on top of desks, and occasionally they need switching off and then on again.
It's a bit unfair to youth offending team workers. Lecturers also probably use computers more than they used to, perhaps. So, let me pause, let me change the subject. Let me talk about two problems for the applied social researcher that I deliberated upon in the course of doing the PhD. One's political, really, one's theoretical. And then briefly, I'll also reflect on some implications of this for methodology. So, first of all, I would suggest that against applied social researchers, there can be a charge of collusion. So essentially what you have is you have the applied criminologist, and the applied criminologist spends perhaps most of his time looking at the poor. What this turns him into is something like an agent of the state, or if you like, the Gruffalo. Not the Gruffalo, but a kind of harmless monster. There's the charge of collusion. Robson describes this dilemma for applied social researchers as follows. You may, overtly or covertly, be serving the agendas of those in positions of power, perhaps hired to seek sticking plaster solutions to complex and intractable problems. Now, in criminology, where the problems and solutions lie in the realm of justice and morality, the danger is argued by some to be even more acute. Rhys Walters, for example, observes that a vast amount of funding for criminological research is directed to administrative projects that aim to improve existing apparatus of crime control. Such structures, he argues, reinforce existing inequalities as they are focused on the crimes of the poor. The crimes of the powerful, meanwhile, remain under-investigated and so unseen. So there's the first problem. The second one is the charge of empiricism. And this is perhaps, for an academic, the more wounded. This charge, then, is that knowledge produced by the applied researcher has little intrinsic value as knowledge per se. For much the same reason that the research is politically compromised, which is to do with the questions being asked and the interpretations being made, it is also theoretically impotent. Bierstedt, writing over 60 years ago, makes the following observations about community studies. So he says, community studies have come to be increasingly popular and are in many places considered to be examples of sociological research par excellence. We currently labour under the impression that for some reason it is important to invade American communities with a battery of schedules and questionnaires and to compile as many facts about them as it is possible to stuff into a filing cabinet. Insofar as sociology is concerned, community studies have probably reached the points of diminishing returns. The US Department of Agriculture has every reason to study more communities. The contemporary sociologist, almost none. Although it is doubtless a radical statement, there is substantial ground for asserting that the sociologist, insofar as he is a scientist, has no present business in the field unless he is testing a hypothesis or trying to corroborate one. Okay, so this touched a nerve, this quotation. I actually, before I got involved in youth crime research, had done a host of community studies, for example. And if you're an academic, you want to generate interesting knowledge, I think. So I pondered an escape route for the applied social researcher from these dilemmas. My solution emerged from contrasting two forms of applied social research. So two case studies. First of all, very, very briefly, experimental criminology. Okay. Now the information imagined here by Lawrence Sherman, who is one of the proponents of experimental criminology, will be realised, so he argues, by criminological researchers testing out all manner of crime prevention strategies, ideally through the use of random controlled trials like those employed in medicine to assess the effectiveness of new treatments. So what Sherman's saying is that what we need, what criminology needs more of, is neutral, objective, criminological science. Imagine Professor Sherman having fallen on hard times and turning from the state to other kinds of clients. Want to know the most effective way of bumping off your wife? Experimental criminology holds the key. fed up of not being able to get into houses. We tested 7 different modes of entry in domestic buildings. For results, go to www.criminologyforcriminals.com. So the point is that no criminology can be, I don't think, apolitical or amoral. Writing about Sherman's positive evaluation of the use of stop and frisk, stop and search tools, to prevent violent crime in the US, Carr points out that no amount of methodological rigour can liberate social scientists from choosing what questions they ask. So he says it's not too difficult to picture a forest plot. You know what I mean by a forest plot? All these dots around a graph of studies that demonstrate the negative consequences of aggressive policing on citizens. So the question becomes, which forest plot takes precedence? The one illustrating, as Sherman's did, that stop and frisk reduces violent crime, or the one demonstrating that the tactic erodes trust and reduces cooperation? Okay. So that's a kind of applied social research, which I think, you know, the guns are pointing at when people say about it that it can be atheoretical, if you like, and politically problematic. But it's a second kind of applied social research, which I would suggest escapes some of these things. So if experimental criminology is the bad cop, then, you know, action research is perhaps the good cop. Action research is a term coined by Lewin to describe a way of generating knowledge about a social system while at the same time attempting to change it. Far from being so on the face of it, action research for me appears to constitute a form of applied social research which is resistant to the dangers I've just been alluding to. Far from being a mere adjunct of the state's power-knowledge-control nexus, action research of the kind exemplified in some studies seeks to give a voice to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups and communities to speak truth to power, to transform existing social relations from the bottom up, at least on a local scale. Far from being divorced from the more lofty theoretical questions engaged in by self-appointed proper sociologists, action research involves using, testing and developing theory in a democratic process which does not privilege one kind of knowledge over another and is able to speak to and with different audiences. Far from insisting upon unbiased, scientific, quantitative methods of inquiry, contemporary action research is open to a range of data and of ways of collecting it, and emphasises the particular advantages, in fact, of qualitative research techniques. Thus, the charge that applied social research is compromised politically, theoretically, and methodologically is challenged at every turn. So briefly, what I mean is that, yes, there's applied social research, but there are different kinds of applied social research, and if you like, experimental criminology for me does illustrate some of the problems that one can get into, political, theoretical, and so on. But it needn't be so. Action research gives us an alternative way of thinking about things. Now, of course, for the PhD, one has to write about quite a lot about methodology and about the methods one used, and I've done that. But I concluded the sort of section on methods in this way, really, by first of all showing all the sort of pieces of research that Stan Cohen lists in the appendix to his classic study of folk devils and moral panics. Quite a lot of qualitative research here, but some quantitative as well. It's a good advert, I would say, for triangulation. And as someone who's used as many methods as possible in my research, I like that. I like this as an example of triangulation. Because the broader lesson, if you take Cohen's methodological approach as an example, the broader lesson is of the importance of theory. people don't remember that book for the appendix, which is where this stuff is listed. But I take some reassurance from Cohen's pluralistic approach to data collection, precisely because it shows that how you obtain information matters less than what you do with it. And so, reflecting on the significance of the collective findings of my empirical work, I'm confident that the evidence itself, whilst framed and limited in certain ways by having been conducted in an applied social research context, is sufficiently robust in terms of reliability and validity to withstand translation into a broader theoretical framework. The main conclusion I've drawn about the potential limitations of applied social research, the ones that I've just briefly alluded to here, is that though they are real enough, the key to transcending them lies in political and theoretical reflection. Okay. So I don't know if you recognise what this is, but this is a picture taken by Voyager, the spaceship Voyager, in 1990, but it took a long time to get back to Earth, so we only recently saw the picture. A picture taken 3.7 billion miles away. Okay. And you can't see it, but there is just the faintest blue dot there, and that's the planet Earth. So why is this here? What this tells us, when we see how insignificant the Earth is, if you like, at this distance, what this tells us is that we're now going to move on to discuss my contribution to knowledge. I'm going to talk about some findings from the 9 studies, the 9 published publications, if you like, around which the PhD brought together and tried to contextualise and so on. And the first was a survey of school students in North London. It was a broader project, actually, this, but my writing on it was to write up the findings from a survey of school students about their experiences of violence. And having done that big literature review that I referred to before, actually, when I went back and looked at this study, what I found was that I should have been spending more time in the library at the time. Because actually, you know, what you have here is a list of findings from the survey, but in brackets kind of the references to other researchers who'd found just this thing. But I'll just pick out a couple of things here. That more pupils reported being a victim than being a perpetrator of antisocial behaviour and violence. Okay, so something I mentioned before. And also that there was a positive correlation between being a perpetrator and being a victim. Okay, so all these points other researchers had found, it would have been good at the time to have related the findings to the broader research. But as an applied social researcher, I moved on to the next project. Okay. Secondly, I was involved with colleagues, or senior colleagues, in quite a big Home Office research study of the effects of exclusion from school on offending. And what we found, broadly, this was commissioned by the Home Office, and what they wanted to know was whether, indeed, exclusion caused offending, and if there was any independent effect, if you like. Well, we found that, indeed, exclusion did sometimes trigger a complex chain of events which served to loosen the young person's affiliation and commitment to a conventional way of life. But actually what we found, and we didn't make ourselves so popular with the Home Office, although they managed to squeeze out the bit of the report that they needed, what we really found was that you could not separate permanent exclusion from a whole series of wider issues to do really with social exclusion. On moving to Middlesex, I was involved again with colleagues in a study of street crime victimisation amongst young people, again of school age, in a high crime area. What I would draw out, it was a qualitative study. This one, you know, what we found amongst the people we talked to was a sense of fatalism, a sense of shit happens. A real sense of injustice, though, about, you know, just because this is where I was born, why do I have to put up with it? A reluctance, which we know about all too well, amongst young people to report being the victim of crime, a feeling of being let down on all sides, not least because of the fact that young people are excluded from certain areas, and yet they are simultaneously more likely to be victims than perpetrators, as we said. An accommodation with violence, you get used to it. A need for individualised safety strategies. You work your own way out of being safe. And to some extent, the research that I'd done around victimisation, anyway, was brought together in a chapter for a book about children as victims, which concluded like this. And notwithstanding the growing evidence about children's victimisation, I concluded that existing research suggests that children and young people in public spaces feel over-policed and underprotected, viewed with suspicion rather than care, and that the challenge for government and society remains to explore and promote ways of reversing this perception. So, those 4 studies looked at victimisation and also a little bit at offending and the relationship between offending and exclusion. And then the next 5 studies looked, if you like, at the other side, looked at youth justice type interventions. And quite a lot of it has been around, some work around mentoring, okay. If I'm known for anything anywhere, it's because I've done some research into mentoring. And I'm going to, in describing the work on mentoring, I'll show you a love story. Okay? Because initially, when I first read about and was asked to evaluate mentoring schemes, I kind of had a love affair with it. I could see, you know, that mentoring and mentors offered these sorts of things: commitment, friendship, good listening, and trust. They were volunteers, no one was paying them to do it, they were wise, they were flexible, and so on. So my initial research into mentoring was like that. I could see these benefits and, you know, very much talk them up. We'll come back to mentoring. But I was also involved in a number of different studies. Not all of them got published. So I'm only able for the PhD by Public Works to talk about ones that get published. One was a very small scale study in Luton of some drugs education projects. And broadly, what the research found was that peer mentoring, one of the methods, and project-based learning, another, appeared good ways of communicating information to young people. By and large, the information was grounded, it was participatory, it was non-judgmental, it was modest. Okay. But I did wonder, I did ask the question, if more young people know about drugs, will fewer take them? There is a question. Still, and I'm thinking about that, this process of reflecting on the role of applied social research, still this wasn't the most critical piece of work that I've ever done, and if I just show you this, then you get something of what I mean, because what I mean is, you know, the problems that we're used to and the fact that certain substances are illegal and so on is socially constructed, and it's socially constructed differently in different parts of the world at different times. And in the sense I was saying, you know, drugs education delivered objectively, no problem, and someone cited my work as an example of, well, you know, drugs education is an objective. Why is it that the government is paying for some people to go in to schools and deliver drugs education? Why aren't they doing other things? Not objective in that sense. Anyway, I did some more research into mentoring, and basically we settled down. We got married. Because I found, you know, mentoring works sometimes. Okay? Some of the passion had gone, but it works sometimes with some people, and probably it's best when it's integrated in a wider programme of education, training or work. It's also important, I was saying, in this publication which referred to here, a chapter in a book, that mentoring be seen as a tool for emancipation rather than one correction. So that was, I wasn't sure whether mentoring really worked in terms of work with young offenders. I could see that it worked with young people and so on. But particularly for working with young offenders, I wasn't quite sure. Nevertheless, we were happily married for a while. Another study, another chapter, another book, another desk-based study. And I looked, this is a few years on now from 1998. This was written in sort of the middle of the first decade, 2007 or so, at the youth justice system that had been delivered by New Labour. And I by now I was a bit more sceptical. And in particular, and what this wonderful picture, I think, it's a Banksy, this one, what this is intended to convey is something about the potential for net widening, okay, a phrase of Stan Cohen's again. But by introducing lots and lots of methods to try and nip the problem of youth crime in the bud, effectively the net of social control broadened. And what you had in the early years of the New Labour administration was a big increase in the number of what's called the first-time entrants to the youth justice system. This was a concern, not least because at that time the numbers of young people in prison was also growing. So you had a widening of the net of social control, and certainly no dramatic changes in the crime rate. So I'm becoming a bit more critical, I hope, and a bit more sceptical. And so I'm afraid, me and mentoring, we had a bit of a separation. Here's me saying, it's not you, darling, it's me. So this, by now, my thoughts about mentoring have become a bit more I've become a bit of a skeptic, because, you know, what I discovered, and others have discovered, was that actually lots of research was showing that most of the time mentoring didn't work, okay? It still did on some occasions, but evaluation after evaluation was tending to show that, you know, for every person for whom it worked, it didn't work for many others. Mentoring, of course, had been seen as well as a cost-effective solution to the problem of youth crime. All these volunteers doing the work, it turned out to be more expensive. Lots of other things. And in an article that I wrote, I drew attention to the fact that the original mentor in Odysseus' tale, the original mentor was actually the goddess, and now I've forgotten her name, the goddess
Athene.
Athene, thank you. The goddess Athene. So the goddess Athene sort of essentially sort of takes over the spirit of the chap who had been entrusted by Odysseus' son to look after Odysseus' son Telemachus. That's what happens in the original tale. And Athene assumes his form, assumes mentor's form, and actually sends Telemachus off on adventures, tells him to run away from home and so on. So anyway, I've probably not clarified that very well, but the point of what I'm saying is, you know, with this disillusion about mentoring, is that perhaps the moral of community-based work with young people is clear enough that mentoring might not work, but a mythical goddess might do the trick. So, we get to the conclusion, okay, and to Utopian Youth Justice. And I begin that final chapter with a quote from John Pitts, which says that in Britain the relationship between criminal justice policy and youth crime is at best oblique. Okay. What I wanted to do in the PhD was to sort of bring together those different pieces of the jigsaw that I've talked about. So that's what I'm going to try and do in conclusion. I'm quite fortunate, really. I was quite fortunate in that, you know, by doing quite a lot of different types of research, what I actually got was sort of some research and some thinking that I've done about how we understand crime, how we understand youth crime, how we understand youth justice. If you like, I've been afforded a glimpse at all four corners of the square of crime. Okay. The square of crime, I should say, was a sort of theoretical device conjured up at Middlesex University by the left realists in the 1980s. I know that will mean more to some of you than to others, and so on. The square of crime suggests that to understand the problem of crime, we need to understand both the offender and the victim. We need to understand the formal agency of the state, the formal response to crime, and the informal response that you might get in the public, in the media, and so on. So, victimisation, I'm going to be very quick as I go through these, just to sort of summarise the key points. So when we think of youth crime, what I would say is when we think of youth crime, we tend to think of offenders, not of victims. Okay? When we think of youth crime, we tend to think of offenders, not of victims. Yet, in some contexts, they're the same person, but on a different day. Victimisation and offending, we also know, are unevenly distributed. The poorer the neighbourhood, the higher the likelihood of victimisation, all the way up to murder. There is agency, there is choice, but in restricting circumstances. Victimisation is a social problem, I want to argue, and a social responsibility. Even if we do attribute responsibility for crime to individuals, it's harder to blame victims for the problem when we know that victimisation is patterned by class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, geography, and so on, these social factors. This does not mean that the violent, implosive street crime, which afflicts the poorest inner city neighbourhoods of the UK, can be reduced to poverty or its correlates. For one thing, this would be to deny the role of conspicuous consumption of wealth in the generational social strain. For another, not all poor neighbourhoods are crime-ridden. Of course, only a minority of residents in such neighbourhoods are involved in crime. And for a third, why deny that family breakdown, bereavement, illness, addiction, disaffection, anger, sloth, domestic violence, recklessness, and prejudice are in some way connected to crime? How else do we explain the royal family? But it's equally fallacious to reduce the problem of youthful street crime to individual or familial characteristics, not to acknowledge the role of poverty. What is now termed social exclusion remains the most important correlate of delinquency. To quote Jeff Pearson from his classic study Hooligan, A History of Respectable Fears, when the cobwebs of historical myth are cleared away, then we can begin to see that the real and enduring problem that faces us is not moral decay, or declining parental responsibility, or undutiful working mothers, or the unparalleled debasement of popular amusements, or any other symptom of spiritual degeneration amongst the British people. Rather, it's a material problem, the inescapable reality of the social reproduction of an underclass, of the most poor and dispossessed, is the material foundation to these hooligan continuities. So, turning to the bits of my work that have looked not so much at youth crime but at youth justice, I would follow others in arguing that the transformation of youth justice brought into being by the Crime Disorder Act was based as much on political calculation as on meeting the needs of young victims and offenders. It's more complex, of course, than this, but what I mean by that is that, and what others say, for example, is that by putting youth crime at the centre of its electoral strategy, it was sort of a very important part of the electoral strategy, New Labour understood how it was going to gain votes. Okay. So as much political calculation as understanding of the real problem of youth crime and victimisation. My work on mentoring represents a case study in one area of the new youth justice, whose implications reflect and reveal the logic, but also the hubris of the wider strategy. Mentoring fitted in with the suite of preventative strategies developed under the aegis of the Youth Justice Board, and that it chimed with the kinds of behavioural and skills training identified within the Home Office under the banner, What Works. Whilst lacking the clinical rigour associated with cognitive behavioural therapy, the logic underpinning mentoring is similar in the sense that it is under the advice and guidance of a trusted and trustworthy role model that the at-risk mentee will recover their moral compass and engage in the kind of purposeful activity needed to fulfil their potential as a good citizen. The logic of mentoring rests on a particular diagnosis of the youth crime problem in targeting certain neighbourhoods and certain groups, for example, teenage parents, children not in education, employment and training, the so-called NEETs. New Labour's social exclusion policies implicitly reflected moral underclass and social inclusion versions of social exclusion discourse. So social exclusion becomes the result of the fecklessness of individuals and families, or the lack of opportunities for them to rejoin society. In respect of bad parenting, or the absence of parents, and especially fathers, which New Labour had identified as one of the biggest causes of serious juvenile delinquency, a potential role for mentors, according to Jack Straw, who was of course Home Secretary at the time, was as a kind of surrogate parent. But above all, perhaps, implicit in the idea of mentoring is that the causes of crime lie within the individual. The mentor's role is to help the young person to take responsibility for their own actions. The model offers a flexible friend with the potential theoretically to address different risk factors according to circumstance: drug misuse, difficult family relationships, peer group pressure, problems at school, impulsivity, and so on. This doesn't mean that mentoring does not sometimes work for some individuals. It clearly does, and this is not a bad thing. But where it works, it's because mentors have helped their mentees to adapt, to skill up, work hard, and follow the rules. It may be that some young people with a criminal record will be successfully mentored into a promising career, but it's as well to remember that some are simultaneously being mentored into the local gang, and that what prevents many young people from taking the more socially acceptable route is the parlous state of the local labour market. So interventions such as mentoring may help to heal those wounded by the inherent contradictions of late modern capitalist societies, but if in so doing they also serve to deflect attention from the underlying generative factors of exclusion, they can be interpreted as doing the devil's work for them. Now that is quite clever. I'm quite proud of this, you see. What you have is all those different pieces of the jigsaw, and what they spell is utopian. Just can't resist it. It took ages, far too long. But putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, I would characterise youth justice interventions such as mentoring in the same way that Marx and Engels viewed Robert Owen and others' attempts to establish living models of socialism in the north of England as utopian. These models were based, Marx and Engels argued, on an idealistic conception of human nature that was abstracted from the material reality of industrial capitalism and the conflict of interests which it breeds and depends upon. So likewise, a faith in mentoring as a solution to youth crime can only be sustained if one believes that the problem resides within the individual and their personal history and circumstances, abstracted from the uneven and uncertain society in which they live. But what of that question mark? There's Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. And that's how I like it. That's how in some ways I think of people who work in youth justice. They're going to have to keep pushing. And I would not like to see lost in my own reflexive and critical analysis the positive aspects of mentoring and the peer-based drugs education practice which I've witnessed. My research in these areas has provided reliable and valid evidence of the small but tangible gains which can be achieved by small-scale projects working with disadvantaged and vulnerable young people, and of the dedication and commitment of practitioners and volunteers involved with them. Utopianism does not characterise such interventions at that level. Those at the coalface are typically well aware of the bigger social and economic forces underpinning youth crime or drug misuse or so on, and of the restrictive circumstances in which they and their clients must operate. Last slide, so we're very nearly there. In States of Denial, Stanley Cohen, in his final book, Stan Cohen, analysed the ways in which various forms of suffering are denied, from the smoker, who refuses to take on board the irrefutable evidence of the harmful effects of tobacco. There you go, Alistair. To the parent who does not acknowledge that their partner is abusing their child. To the villagers living nearby a concentration camp, not quite understanding the significance of the occasional smoke and noxious smell. To the TV watcher who turns over when an appeal is made in the wake of a family. So Cohen is compelled and dismayed by the seemingly timeless and universal human capacity to see and not see, to know and not know about, the unpleasant, appalling and grotesque things happening to and around them. That word seemingly though is important. Cohen also describes the manner in which extreme denials of suffering are scarcely ever sustained. The leaders of the Holocaust are brought to trial. Apartheid is abolished. The suspicion of institutional racism becomes official. And so what Cohen does is he draws attention to the sometimes heroic stands against suffering and for justice which individuals and groups can and do make. And this reminds us all that to see or not to see, to know or not know, is a choice, albeit in circumstances not of our own choosing. In the critical criminological tradition in which I've sought to locate my own work, there are long-standing strategic tensions between resistance and reform, between principled critique and pragmatic engagement, between idealism and realism. These strategic tensions have their theoretical counterparts in disputes over the role and nature of social control, over what are the key variables, in the broadest sense, in explaining crime. And they characterise methodological arguments concerning whether, what and how things should be measured, at what time and in what place. What unites critical criminologists, however, is a concern with power and powerlessness, with harm and suffering, with offending and victimisation, again in the broadest sense, and a conviction not that science equals progress, but that the status quo is not inevitable, and that not knowing is insufficient excuse. So my modest contributions to this tradition, as represented by my published works, is to add to our understanding of youth crime and youth justice in the following small ways. On the one hand, my work has illuminated the suffering experienced by young victims of school and street-based crime and violence, and revealed how this is concentrated and contributes towards broader forms of social disadvantage, whilst also emphasising that victimisation and offending correlate, not because of the characteristics of the individuals and families involved, but because of the restricting circumstances of late modern capitalism. On the other hand, my work on mentoring is a case study in the way in which such solutions to the crime problem are destined to fail precisely because they focus predominantly on changing the attitudes, behaviour and circumstances of those deemed a risk to society, and so they cannot and do not have a significant bearing on the wider social and economic context. The important caveat to this, however, is that for as long as such interventions mitigate suffering, we're better with than without them. Utopia and reality may be closer than we realise. Thank you.